Hi, my name is Bridget Richardson, and I'm the Assistant Director of Ecumenical and Pastoral Initiatives at the Nesty Center for Faith and Culture at University of St. Thomas in Houston. And I'm here with Dr. Stuart Squires, my coworker, and Associate Director of the Nesty Center for Faith and Culture, and Associate Professor of Theology at University of St. Thomas in Houston, and Dr. Andrew Starin, theologian and instructor at Regis University in Denver, Colorado. So thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Bridget.
Yeah, and you two know each other. You're connected. So let's hear about that connection.
Yeah, Andy and I went to the University of Chicago together for a master's degree. We met there. And then we both coincidentally took a year off and both ended up at Catholic University for our PhDs. I knew he was going there. He didn't know I was going there because we kind of lost touch. And on the first day of class, we ended up being in a Latin class together. And so I was looking for him. And after class, I walked up to him and I could see the look on his face. He's like, "That looks like Stuart, but it can't be because what would he be doing here?" But there I was. And then we finished our dissertations on in the same semester and graduated at the same time.
Nice. Okay, well, let's jump right in. You know, we titled this COVID-19 and the Doctor of Grace. And as you two have educated me via email, the Doctor of Grace is St. Augustine, who a lot of us know and love. And I so love his conversion story. And Dr. Starin is very close to Augustine and knows his work. So maybe you can give a brief background about who he is and why he's so important to the Catholic Church and people in general who are trying to, I guess, figure things out, especially during the pandemic.
Yeah, sure. Augustine was born in the middle of the 300s in North Africa, which is part of the Roman Empire at that point. And he spent most of his first 30 years kind of wandering around different thought worlds and different social worlds, all trying to kind of find what he would come to understand to be is the truth about his life. And we have a profoundly important work from him in the Confessions, which is his own conversion story, his own narrative about finding God. The story kind of becomes a paradigm for Christian conversion stories since the year 400, about when it was finished. He would then become a priest and very quickly a bishop of the North African city of Hippo, and be the most significant thinker in Christian history outside of the Bible. Stu used to give me a really hard time about anything that I would say that from kind of theological history from the year 400 on to now. He would point out, well, Augustine already talked about that. Augustine already said that. Augustine already decided that. And he would remind me over and over again that there's nowhere you can go in theology that Augustine hasn't been there first. And so a lot of the basic concepts that Christians use, things like original sin and grace, we can trace back our understanding of those ideas to Augustine.
Yeah, that's so profound to say that those foundational things within our faith are traced back to St. Augustine. And I know, Dr. Squires, you've been thinking a lot about the pandemic and how St. Augustine can kind of be a voice for us in this time. So maybe you can share a little bit about what you've been thinking and writing about.
Yeah, I'm always constantly thinking, what would Augustine say about such and such a topic? And of course, during this COVID crisis, I've often asked myself that question. We've all seen a lot of articles in the news these days about people in quarantine who die alone, right? Physically, their family, their loved ones, their parents, their friends are not allowed to be physically in their presence. And there have been a lot of articles. There's one CNN article that was written recently that talked about, the inability to be with our loved ones as they die is part of this sort of instinctual primal fear, right? So this taps into the worst case scenario, that dying alone itself is a fate worse than death in a sense. And so as I've been reading a lot of those stories, Augustine has come to mind because he chose to die alone, which might not surprise us if Augustine were, an introvert. He always wanted to be alone. But we see in his confessions and the rest of his life, he was not an introvert. He was the exact opposite. He was the center of his social life. There's a lot of stories about Augustine and his being with his friends and his family. I'll just share a couple of them. The most famous story probably of Augustine is when he's about 15 or 16, and he had just come back from school. His dad ran out of money, so he couldn't send him to school anymore. So he's at home for about a year, and he's bored because he doesn't have anything to do. And his friends are out, and they steal some pears, and they throw pears at these pigs. And Augustine gives this really beautiful theological reflection, saying, we didn't need these pears. We had better pears that tasted better, and we didn't steal the pears to throw at the pigs. We stole them for the sake of the fall itself, right? He says, I loved the fall for the fall itself. And he says, alone I would not have done it, right? If he had been walking down the street by himself and he saw these pears, he wouldn't have done it. Now, that's not to say that he was peer pressured into it, but the idea that these sort of sins are always taste sweeter in a group. Another example I think of is when he comes back from Carthage years later. He's a young man, and he becomes friends with somebody in his hometown who falls sick, and he's on his deathbed, and his parents, Augustine is not a Christian at this time, and his parents, this friend's parents, have him baptized, but then he sort of recovers. And Augustine sort of mocks it and sort of dismisses it, says some really snarky, rude things about the baptism. And the man was totally unconscious when it happened, so he didn't know it happened. But he's so fundamentally transformed by it that he tells Augustine basically shut up and stop being mean about this. And Augustine, he was kind of surprised, but he says, he thinks to himself, all right, well, when he kind of calms down, I'll sort of go back to making fun of those stupid Christians. His friend recovers, but then relapses and dies. And Augustine gives this really beautiful discourse about how heartbroken he was, how he wandered town, and everywhere he looked, he saw his friend, and he couldn't bear to be in town anymore. So he left town again. And in fact, he never tells us his friend's name. This is about 20 years later when he's writing this, and he can't bear to mention his friend's name. And I'll just give one more quick example. This is a family relationship with his mother, Monica. They have a sort of famous relationship throughout history. Augustine was not particularly close, and there's clearly some tension with his father, but he and his mother had a close relationship. And one of the famous stories about them is that after Augustine converts and is baptized, they're returning back from Milan, going home to North Africa, and they're in the port of Ostia in Italy, and they have this sort of shared mystical experiences. And scholars have talked about how this, mystical experiences are usually individual, right? You and God. And this is one of the few, if only, mystical experiences shared between two people. So these are just some stories to point out just how social Augustine was. Right? He's not an introvert. So when he's, years later and he's on his deathbed, again, you would assume that he would want to have friends and family around him as he dies. But the exact opposite is true. I like to just read this paragraph, if you don't mind. And this is from Placidius, who's a younger friend of his, a contemporary who lived in the same monastery that Augustine lived in. And Placidius is there when Augustine is dying. So he says, God granted that the life of this holy man should be a long one, the benefit and happiness of Holy Church, and he lived 76 years, nearly 40 of them as a priest or bishop. In the course of them, he often told us, intimate conversation, that the reception of baptism did not absolve Christians, and especially priests, however estimable, from the duty of doing fitting and adequate penance before departing from this life. And he acted on this in his last and fatal illness. For he ordered those Psalms of David, which are especially penitential, to be copied out, and when he was very weak, he used to lie in bed facing the wall where the sheets of paper were put up, gazing at them and reading them, and copiously and continuously weeping as he read. Moreover, so as not to have his thoughts distracted by anyone, about 10 days before his death, he asked that those of us who were with him not let anyone go in to him, except at the times when the doctors came to see him or food was brought to him. This was attended to and carried out, and during the whole of that time he gave himself to prayer. So here's a man who's a social butterfly. He described himself when he was a young man. He says, I was a man about town, right? He was a social butterfly. He was the center of any, sort of a social alpha male. But here's a man who says, look, in my dying days, what I want to do is be focused on God and repent of my sins, because he's in his 70s. He's accumulated plenty of sins over his life. And so this is what I've sort of been thinking about over the past couple of months. In the midst of this fear of dying alone that coronavirus is bringing on, I think Agustin can offer a model for us about how not only is it of dying alone not necessarily the worst fear that we should have, but the exact opposite, that it can be an opportunity, an invitation for us to confront our sins and to confront God directly without distraction.
And Dr. Sterin, what do you think about Agustin in his final time and how he chose to use that time?
Well, Augustine gives us an example of somebody from the beginning who was never content to leave his life unexamined. And we have this pattern in his life that we see most clearly in the Confessions, but it's present in his sermons and in his letters, about trying to kind of see what he's actually doing, see what's going on in him, and ask, is what I'm doing what I ought to be doing? Is what I'm thinking what I ought to be thinking? And so this, the fact that at the end of his life he's focused on how ought I die is consistent with his entire life. The line from the opening of his Confessions, that's probably his most often quoted line over and over. You've made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. That idea of restlessness is present in Augustine. It takes him a while to figure out exactly what he's restless for and to name it as such. But that feeling of, yes, this world is great. What I have is great. My success is wonderful. But this isn't enough. This isn't what I've been made for. This isn't what will ultimately bring me peace. That impulse is present in Augustine throughout, and I've gone back to that line throughout my life over and over, and specifically now, like Stu over there, I've also been kind of paying attention to some of these. I mean, we all have, right? The articles, you're trying to figure out which articles should I be reading now, which ones are just going to terrify me, which ones are helpful and giving me a sense of truth, and which ones are fear-mongering. And one of the ones that jumped out at me was, or one of the themes that has jumped out at me has to do with this question of what happens when we get back to normal. Can we get back to normal? What's normal going to look like? And the more, I think, challenging articles in this on this topic for me have been the ones that say, what, should we get back to normal, right? the way we've been living perhaps isn't the way we ought to be living. Much like this question of the way that we think we ought to die maybe isn't the way that we ought to die. Also, maybe we need to rethink the way we've been living. And I think, again, the Confessions gives us an example of someone who's constantly asking himself, all right, so I finally achieved this thing that I've wanted to achieve. Now what? Right? Is the restlessness gone, or is the restlessness continuing here with me? And Augustine, when he finally has his kind of final dramatic conversion moment, he's recently kind of achieved the highest, the point of his political career up until that the highest point of his political career had just moved past him, and it doesn't fulfill him, right? He's the master rhetorician of the city of Milan. He's giving important speeches, and it's not enough. And what I think COVID-19 is offering us, and I have to be careful about this because I don't want any impression that I think that God's like sending this to us in order to shake us out of our complacency. But I think what we could do at this point is see this as a moment to stop and be attentive to what's going on in our hearts and in our minds, and ask ourselves, well, so these things I was pursuing up until this point, the images of success and happiness that I've been so clinging to, am I happier without them, or can I let go of them? Or do I want to get back on this cycle once things open up and my world returns somewhat to normal, whatever that normal looks like? The opening of Book 2 of Confessions, Augustine says that he pursued a multitude of things and went into pieces. That his focus was so dissipated over kind of the social, the political, the professional, the religious. His focus was dissipated, and he himself found emptiness as a result of that. Book 2 ends with him talking about becoming a land of famine to himself, becoming empty and starving. And that image of starving, he kind of continues to play with, not only in the Confessions, but elsewhere in his work. And he recognizes something that I think we could all feel, that when you have eaten bad food for a long time, when you've gotten into the habit of eating chips and cake and stuff that's not healthy, it's actually really difficult to get ourselves to turn and get back to eating salad, right? And he uses that image and this other image later in the Confessions about like knowing that we ought to be waking up but not wanting to wake up. It's such a human moment in kind of the later books of the middle books of the Confessions, when he says, I knew I needed to get up, but I kept saying just a little bit more, right? And we want to do this too. We can look at our lives and say, you know what, I need to change this thing, or I need to change that thing, or this goal that I have in mind maybe isn't the best goal for me, but we say, well, I'll deal with that later. Give me 5 more minutes. Give me 5 more minutes. And, I want to change, but not yet. And what I have kind of hoped for in this moment is that we're being forced to take a moment to stop, right? We're forced, most of us, those of us who are fighting on the front lines of all of this certainly don't have that opportunity, but most of us have this point to ask, like, this thing that I've been pursuing, this life I've been desiring, is this going to be enough for me? Is this really going to bring peace to my restlessness? But to recognize that this restlessness in us is not going to be calmed by the next tier of success professionally, or the next new thing that we're going to buy, or the next kind of expansion of our social circle, or whatever it is. But that restlessness is actually a good thing that keeps us yearning for God. So I think if we can have the opportunity to name that restlessness, to see it for what it is, to see it as good, and to give us a chance to be honest with what we are pursuing, and kind of try to reorient our actions and our desires so that we can kind of come out of this, not going back to normal, but falling more deeply in love with God.
Yeah, I think that's really well put together. And it feels like it's almost a paradox too, because you're talking about the restlessness that I know people are experiencing right now in a myriad of ways, right? It could be anything on the spectrum in terms of restlessness, but also the emptiness that you're saying that Augustine came to toward the end of Confessions. How do you pull those two things together, restlessness and emptiness? Because it seems like it's opposite, right? But how is that, integrated in one person?
Well, I think it has to do with the fact that the restlessness is there because we're made for greater things than the next promotion or the next party or the next iPhone, right? Like, what we are made for is this deep, sustaining, lasting relationship with God. That's the purpose of our being, and the ways in which we kind of are able to embrace that desire that doesn't lead to restlessness, that requires us to kind of go after those things that bring us closer to God. Ultimately, that's only God, as we see in the description of Augustine's death, that he came to recognize that. But in our daily life, before we come into the beatific vision and face God face to face, whatever, our everyday life now, that means we find the ways to love best. That means we find the ways to be generous and merciful and compassionate, and hope, because this is what the gospel teaches us. We hope that those are the ways in which we find ourselves closest to God and least empty. That the restlessness is most at peace at that point, because we are close to God in being close to God's mercy.
And when you are close to God's mercy in the way that Dr. Squires is talking about with regard to, people who are dying because of the pandemic, how do we show compassion and empathy to people who aren't at the place where they're ready to encounter their sins and really own up to that? They're not there. How do we, with the understanding of maybe Augustine as an example, how do we show compassion and empathy and mercy to those people who are dying?
Well, I don't think any of us are there where we're supposed to be. And Augustine gives us some fairly striking examples even later in his life of being kind of public with his struggles and his own hang-ups. So compassion and mercy, I think, is most. We are closest to being the compassionate and merciful people that we ought to be when we are honest with our own difficulties and struggles, right? It's not so much a matter of me saying, well, I'm where I'm supposed to be, and now I have to be compassionate to all these people who aren't. I think if we remember how generous God has been with us, and how far each of us are from, how far I am from where I need to be, I think it gives me the space in order to interact with others who also are not where they would be best to be. This COVID-19 has brought out a lot from a lot of us. I think when we're at our best, we are most honest about our struggles, about how weird it is to be having these conversations over these over online, and trying to do this while dealing with family concerns, whether family in my house and trying to teach my kids, or recognizing that I've got family and friends elsewhere who I can't be with right now, who I can't support. And I think the more we're honest with these things about ourselves, the more space we give for other people to be honest and open as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Dr. Spires, did you have any other comments about that?
No, I just like listening to Andy talk. He's always an insightful person. I think one thing though, so you brought up, Bridget, the sort of being compassionate at that moment of death. Andy was years ago a chaplain in a hospital, and so he had to deal with some of these things. So I don't know, Andy, if you have any sort of memories of any particular stories or events where those examples that could be applicable to today.
Man, I'm sure
I'm putting you on the spot there.
Yeah, no, I'm sure there are people with much more wisdom when it comes to accompanying the dying and the grieving. I have found that one of my big takeaways from the time I spent in hospital pastoral care was not to be too quick to try to give people answers as to why things are happening in their life, spiritual answers as to why things are happening, and why they're suffering, why their loved one is dying, why they're dying. I think there's we have to insist on God's closeness to us, whether we are dying or mourning the loss of loved ones who have. But we need to be patient with ourselves and with others, very patient when it comes to trying to figure out where God's presence kind of manifests itself and how we begin to make sense of that presence. We trust in God's promise that we're not alone, and we hope that over time meaning may kind of slowly be discernible in this situation. But to go very quickly and say, well, God's will is clear here, God wants us to feel this or see this, I think we need to be hesitant to assert those things. God wants us to love, God wants us to be merciful, God wants us to be compassionate. What that looks like in each person's given life is going to be different, and it's important to give people the space and the time to discern that love, mercy, and compassion in their own lives.
Thank you for those comments, Dr. Starin. That was really insightful, definitely. And this is the book that he's talking about, Confessions, St. Augustine. It's amazing. It's heavy. The end is heavy. That's not, it gets really deep, and it was unexpected for me. But it's good. It's a beautiful book. And thank you both so much for the conversation on a topic that is hitting people right where it matters, in their heart and in the way that they can encounter each other in love. So thank you both so much.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, have a good day and stay safe and healthy.
You too.